Good afternoon. My name is Frank Almaguer, Assistant Secretary for Administration and Finance of the Organization of American States. And on behalf of Secretary General Jose Miguel Insulza and Assistant Secretary General Albert Ramdin, who today are attending events away from headquarters, it is an honor to welcome each of you and our audience throughout the hemisphere to the 17th lecture in the OAS lecture series of the Americas. We're honored to have with us this afternoon a prominent international figure, Ms. Huguette Labelle, Chair of Transparency International. As many of you know, 2006 was declared the Inter-American Year of the Fight Against Corruption. Ms. Labelle's presentation, therefore, is timely and no doubt will be well received. The OAS is the premier regional forum for multilateral dialogue and is dedicated to promoting peace, security, and prosperity in the Western Hemisphere. As OAS Secretary General Jose Miguel Insulza said at a meeting of an anti-corruption event in March of this year, fighting corruption is a key aspect of the democratic exercise of power, as laid out under the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and thus it is a priority issue for the OAS member states. Quoting Secretary General Insulza, governments have to continuously be more efficient in tackling and resolving people's problems, but at the same time they have to be more transparent in formulating and implementing their public policies and practices. They need to vigorously punish corruption committed by public officials as well as by the private interests that corrupt them. I end the quote. In 1996, the OAS member states adopted the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, the first treaty of its kind in the world. The Inter-American Convention Against Corruption states that fighting corruption strengthens democratic institutions and prevents distortions in the economy, improprieties in public administration, and damage to society's moral fiber. Among other provisions of the Convention Against Corruption, requires parties to adopt domestic laws criminalizing certain activities, including the acceptance or solicitation of bribes by public officials. It also establishes extradition requirements and calls for mutual assistance and cooperation in investigating and prosecuting acts of corruption. Parties to the treaty agreed to consider an extensive list of measures to prevent corruption, such as registering the income, assets, and liabilities of officials in certain public posts, assuring honest, open systems for government hiring and procurement, and establishing measures to deter bribery by publicly held companies. 28 OAS member states now participate in the follow-up mechanism for the implementation of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, which was established in response to a mandate from the Third Summit of the Americas. This mechanism, known by its Spanish acronym MESASIC, tracks how the parties to the Anti-Corruption Treaty are implementing its provisions and recommends concrete measures the member states can take to improve compliance. Ms. Labelle will provide further insights into the region's challenges in fighting corruption and achieving accountability, but I wanted to share with you the important work that is being carried out at the OAS to address this common problem. Thank you.
Ambassadors, permanent representatives, permanent observers, members of various delegations, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have a very special privilege this afternoon to introduce to you a Canadian icon, the first woman to address this series, and the 17th speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, she's an educator, a public administrator, a humanitarian, an environmentalist, but above all, a human rights advocate. Huguette Lebel is currently the Chancellor of the University of Ottawa and Vice President of the Council of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, member of the Board of Directors of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, CRC Sogoma, Director of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, as I mentioned. She is also the Chairman of Transparency International and member of the Board of Trustees of the African Virtual University, member of the Advisory Board and Trustees of the Council for Export Development Cooperation, the World Bank Institute, the Canadian Bureau for International Education, and the list of accomplishments, engagements continue. I wish to bring your attention at this time to her biography in your program before you. I do not wish to monopolize any more of this time, but to present to you our speaker, Huguette Lebel. Madame, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for these kind words, and good afternoon, everyone. C'est vraiment un plaisir que d'être ici cet après-midi avec vous et de passer quelque temps ensemble. Es un gran placer para mí estar aquí con ustedes hoy para abordar un tema tan importante como es la corrupción en las Américas. Siendo yo misma ciudadana de la región, no es de sorprender que tengo un deseo muy profundo de ver a la región prosperar. Reducir el impacto devastante de la corrupción sobre la vida de las personas, las democracias y las economías de la región es esencial para la prosperidad, estabilidad y fundamentalmente aliviar a millones de ciudadanos de la pobreza. Let me set the stage for my remarks by telling you about my recent trip to Guatemala for the 12th International Anti-Corruption Conference. I found an extraordinary group of over 1,000 people attending from over 100 countries and of more than 20 countries from this region. 6 Central American presidents from Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, as well as representatives from Belize and the Dominican Republic, signed the Guatemala Declaration, committing their countries to concrete steps in the fight against corruption and in the promotion of transparency. This has sent a very powerful signal that governments are summoning the political will to give the region's anti-corruption effort the necessary emphasis and momentum. 4 simple truths emerged from this very important conference and were reinforced by my subsequent visits with the leaders of Panama, Peru, and Chile. And these are that countries cannot afford to be complacent about corruption. Expressions of political will, although necessary, is not enough. Governments must take concrete actions. A comprehensive approach is required in that fight as well, and it needs to involve the judiciary, parliaments, the executive of governments, working very closely with civil society, with the business sector. Most importantly, though, the people must demand accountability on the part of their leaders. Throughout my travels in the region, I have witnessed how corruption undermines democracies, distorts economies, and traps people in poverty. And I have seen this around the world as well. Corruption does not make a country poorer just by undermining its economy. It makes the poor poorer because part of their meager earnings, their non-existent disposable income very often, must pay for basic services which otherwise should be free, or to be able to pay in order to gain access at all to services. Essential goods and services, food and medicines, are often diverted by corruption. I have seen how malaria medication or how antibiotics have been diluted, making their potency just about nil, and making it certain that people will develop resistance to these. And it leaves people desperate and very often struggling to obtain food, education, and medical care for themselves and for their children. For example, poor people in Mexico are reported to spend up to 17% of their annual income on bribes to get access to the basic services that I mentioned. And this is not, of course, unique in terms of many other countries around the world. But resources that go missing through corruption are also diverted from establishing the systems that ensure transparency and accountability in government, from the services that can be provided to the people of our countries. And this feeds a vicious circle where those with access to funds or bribes take what they can because they can, locking the poor in their poverty. There are many challenges in this region, as there are around the world, and many of you are very familiar with those, but let me highlight a few. And one is that we still have approximately 220, 224 million in Latin America that live in poverty. 30 countries of the Americas, included in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index earlier this month, of these, 25 scored below 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, meaning that experts see corruption as a serious problem in these countries. And of course, worst is that more than a third of our countries scored below 3, meaning that corruption is perceived as rampant. This is sobering, and it's a great reminder about the pervasiveness of graft in our midst. And it is not a one-off result. There is a strong correlation between our Corruption Perception Index and other more local measurement exercises. The countries of Latin America have the greatest inequality in the world. As many of you know, the richest 10% of Latin Americans earn approximately 48% of the region's total income, while the poorest tenth earn just 1.6% according to the World Bank. And while generalizations are sometimes dangerous and one has to be careful with them, this one tells a compelling story of why fighting corruption matters so much for the future of the Americas. Some 10% of GDP in the Americas is lost to corruption annually, according to the Inter-American Development Bank. And it crosses borders. Money laundering transactions in the region are estimated at between 2.5 and 6.3% of GDP. This is not petty cash.